If an old man with silver hair is seen as a burden in the very bakery he once saved, will the truth speak up before or after he is destroyed? The glass door gave a gentle shake as a middle-aged man in a faded flannel jacket, cap pulled low, and an old backpack in tow softly pushed open the entrance to Hearth and Rye's bakery. Morning sunlight poured through the large windows, casting golden hues onto freshly baked loaves that filled the air with the gentle scent of flour, butter, and cinnamon. On the surface, everything seemed to carry the warm and peaceful charm of a small-town bakery. But that man, Mason Ellery, knew better than anyone that what rises from the oven doesn't always reflect the true heartbeat of a place. He had built this place from nothing, once spending hours by the first oven, believing a warm loaf of bread could hold a broken town together. But today he returned not as the CEO of the Hearth and Rye's chain stretching across the state, but as a late applicant under the alias Cal Miller, 47 years old, with no baking experience. He didn't come back for balance sheets or revenue figures, but for something Excel could never show: the eroding soul of the original bakery, and no one in upper management could explain why. The young manager, Harper, with darting eyes and a Bluetooth earpiece seemingly glued to her left ear, gave him a single glance before handing him a white apron and paper hat. "Follow Arthur. He'll show you whatever you need," she said, as if talking about an old appliance that needed sorting. Mason quietly stepped into the back kitchen, where the scent of rising dough mingled with the steady rhythm of the mixer, like the breath of an old home. There stood an elderly man with silver hair, a faded apron, and flour-dusted hands working a large mound of dough on a wooden table. No introductions, no warm welcome, just a curt nod, "Arthur Quinn." But that nod alone brought Mason back to those early mornings 10 years ago, when he had handed Arthur the first key to unlock this very shop. "Ever worked sourdough before?" Arthur asked, his voice raspy but calm. Mason shook his head, replying in a bumbling tone, "Never, but I'd like to learn." Arthur didn't smile, nor did he act surprised. He simply said, "Wash up, then we'll start." There were no judgmental looks, no condescension, just the steady rhythm of someone who no longer expected anyone to remember his name. And for the next hour, Mason was guided by hands that had lived a lifetime in flour, yeast, and heat. Arthur didn't explain much, just demonstrated once and watched. When Mason messed up, there was no sigh, no irritation, just a quiet folding of the dough and a soft remark, "Feel it." Dough has memory. It needs to be remembered, not forced. Words like that, simple but profound, kept Mason glued to the man who knelt over the dough as if speaking to the soul of every loaf. Up front, the bell above the door chimed with the usual morning greetings from regulars. But in the back, the air thickened like proofing yeast. It wasn't the dough or the oven that made it heavy, but the glances those sideways looks laced with quiet disdain. Vanessa, the cashier with makeup perfectly intact despite the flour in the air, stepped in to grab more napkins, glanced at Arthur, then smirked. "Careful, new guy," she said mockingly as she passed. "This old dough whisperer might bore you to sleep." Arthur didn't reply. He kept folding the dough with the precision of a seasoned craftsman. But Mason's fists clenched. In his career, he'd seen many types of employees, but the kind who wrapped cruelty in humor like Vanessa always set off alarms. A few minutes later, a young worker named Cole leaned on the doorway, sneering. "Arthur, that guy forgets customer names 3 times a morning. If he makes it to closing, it's a miracle." Arthur remained silent, gently lifting the dough, turning it, placing it back down like the insult had never landed. Mason stood there, a bit of flour on his nose, heart weighed down. He realized he wasn't just witnessing disrespect, but deliberate neglect. And when Arthur declined the free staff lunch and instead quietly unwrapped a slice of peanut butter bread he brought from home, Mason understood this wasn't just about an old man being ignored. It was about a worn heart being slowly suffocated in the kitchen that once stood for kindness. And he knew, if he didn't step in, the rot wouldn't stop at the dough, it would consume the entire soul of this bakery. The next morning, Mason returned to Hearth and Rye's bakery before the sky had even fully brightened. On the quiet street, The soft golden light spilling through the bakery's frosted glass windows glowed like a smoldering flame, reminding him that this place was once the heart of the neighborhood. As he stepped inside, the scent of rising dough and melting butter filled the air, a smell that couldn't be faked, the very scent he once thought he'd breathe forever, but had lost in the years spent chasing numbers and expansion strategies. Arthur had already arrived, his sleeves rolled up on a flannel shirt worn thin, arms dusted in flour, silver hair tousled like morning fog. He was kneading heavy mounds of dough, cradling them as if he were holding memories. When Mason entered, Arthur didn't even lift his head, just gave a slight nod as if the two had been working together for years. There were no greetings, and none were needed here. The work spoke for itself. All morning, Mason simply stood beside him and observed. Arthur didn't explain with theories. He simply did. When he handed Mason a mound of dough, he didn't say, "Do it like this," but invited him to feel it. "Dough is like a sleeping child," he said. "Don't be rough. Understand it." And when Mason pressed too hard, causing the surface to crack, Arthur didn't scold, just quietly said, "That's a wound. Next time, don't let it happen." Every movement he made was like an old melody, slow, deliberate, and never offbeat. The air in the kitchen seemed to slow down, yielding to a quiet reverence that only comes from those who have truly loved their craft. Mason followed silently, and the longer he watched, the more he realized Arthur was not just a baker. He was the keeper of the flame. A man the entire space orbited around, even if no one in the HR system remembered his name. Still, the mocking glances continued. Vanessa remained unchanged, her sharp eyes slicing through the air whenever she passed the kitchen, letting out a sarcastic whistle when Arthur accidentally spilled a bit of flour on the floor. "Don't let him teach you wrong, too," she murmured to Cole, just loud enough for Mason to hear. But Arthur didn't react. He simply bent down, swept the flour, and continued his work as if no one else existed in the kitchen. Cole even pretended to trip over a flour bin Arthur was using, making it tilt. "Damn it! Who leaves this in the way?" he grumbled, though it was clearly on purpose. Mason remained still. He couldn't speak up yet, not until he'd seen the whole picture. He knew he had to be patient, even as something inside his chest began to ache. Near lunchtime, Arthur took out a small plastic container from his shirt pocket. Inside were two slightly over-toasted slices of bread, thinly spread with peanut butter, and a slightly wrinkled apple. He sat quietly on the back stoop of the bakery, eating in silence, like someone who didn't want to be noticed. Mason sat beside him, offering half of a chicken sandwich from his paper bag. "I can't finish this. Would you mind helping me out?" he asked gently. Arthur smiled, shook his head, and replied, "I'm fine. Better to save what I can. There are more important things in need than this stomach." Mason didn't press further. He just sat there, sipping cold coffee, eyes watching people pass on the street, ears tuned to the silent weight beside him. As they stood up to head back to work, Arthur placed a hand on Mason's shoulder. "You learn fast. The dough suits your hands." Mason nodded, but inside, it felt like a landslide. He had once been named Entrepreneur of the Year, managed hundreds of employees, signed million-dollar contracts, but never before had someone rested a hand on his shoulder with such effortless kindness, as if rank and title didn't exist, only pure humanity. And that was exactly why he knew he had to see the truth through. Arthur didn't deserve to be buried in silence. No one like him should be hidden beneath dough and the echoes of ridicule. Mason knew what was coming would be difficult, but at least now he was no longer unsure why he had returned, and he would not back down. On Tuesday morning, Hearth and Rye's bakery opened to colder weather than usual, with dew still clinging to the glass door handle. Mason had arrived before the lights were even switched on, standing at the sink with his hands soaking in warm water, the sound of clinking trays around him, and the smell of fermenting dough rising from the proofing oven. Arthur, just as consistent as ever, entered in a faded wool coat and a flour-stained cloth loosely tied at his waist, his eyes carrying a gentle smile even though his face showed no sign of joy. They didn't need many words. Their rhythm had become a silent melody, each step of kneading, rolling, proofing, and arranging trays moving like a steady heartbeat in the narrow kitchen. Mason had begun memorizing ingredient names, could now feel when the dough reached just the right hydration, and noticed Arthur never needed a scale. His hands measured each portion with uncanny precision. But what captured Mason's attention that morning didn't happen in the kitchen. It started at the front counter. Around 9 a.m., a thin woman entered the bakery, holding the hand of a little girl about 6 years old with big eyes and a lopsided ponytail. The woman gave Vanessa a faint smile so strained that Mason could feel the unease even from the back. She picked out a few low-cost pastries and a cup of coffee, then carefully counted change from her worn wallet. "I'm sorry. I think I'm still short $3, she whispered, her voice hoarse. Vanessa sighed loudly, glancing around, then raised her voice just enough for nearby customers to hear. "That's the third time this month you've come up short. This is a bakery, not a charity." The little girl looked up at her mother, confused. The air froze for a moment. Some customers turned away silently. Mason, still at the dough table, heard every word, his hands pausing. But before he could react, Arthur stepped out from behind the counter. He said nothing, just gently pulled a crumpled $10 bill from his shirt pocket, placed it in the register, and nodded at Vanessa. "Give her the change, and add a raisin bun for the little one." Vanessa showed clear displeasure, but didn't argue. The woman's eyes welled up in gratitude. The little girl squeezed her mother's hand tighter, then looked up at Arthur and softly mumbled, "Thank you for being nice." He gave a slight nod, said nothing, and quietly returned to the kitchen as if nothing had happened. Mason stood still for a few seconds. Arthur's action wasn't impulsive. It had the feel of routine, of familiarity, as if he had done this many times before, quietly, and without expecting anything in return. And indeed, for the rest of the morning, Mason began to notice something remarkable. Arthur greeted nearly every customer by name. He remembered one customer's daughter had just started college, asked after the sore leg of an elderly man who always bought rye bread and even had a sugar-free loaf ready before a diabetic woman walked through the door. When a high school boy's card got declined, Arthur didn't say a word. He simply placed $3 on the counter and returned to the sink. No one paid attention. No one praised him. But Mason saw it all. He casually asked Cole while gathering trays. "How long has Arthur been working here?" Cole shrugged, chewing gum. "Long time. Too long if you ask me. He's kind, sure, but slow and outdated." "Who still hand measures flour these days?" Mason didn't reply, but a different question echoed in his mind. Who is still this kind in an age of hurry and indifference? At the end of the day, Mason stayed behind in the kitchen as the others left. Arthur was still there, wiping every edge of the counters, brushing flour from the wooden cracks, using a separate cloth to clean the oven knobs. "Why do you stay so late?" Mason asked softly. Arthur replied without turning, "This place feeds a lot of people. I just want to make sure no one suffers tomorrow because of today's neglect." His voice wasn't loud or stern, but it carried more weight than any corporate speech Mason had ever heard. As Mason left the bakery that day, the scent of fresh bread still clung to his clothes, but what stayed deepest was the stirring in his chest. He had once believed he understood loyalty and quiet contribution. But it wasn't until he saw an old man silently place a bill in the register, just so a child could have a warm breakfast, that he realized there are values that don't show up on balance sheets, yet they nourish an entire business. And Arthur was the embodiment of that. But Mason also began to understand kindness like his wouldn't last long without someone stepping up to protect it. And that moment was drawing nearer than ever. Wednesday morning began like any other, but Mason could feel that something was shifting, not in the baking routine, but in the way people looked at one another. Arthur entered the kitchen right on time as always, his silver hair slightly damp with morning mist, and his hands trembling faintly as he lifted a tray of dough. But this time, Mason noticed something different. The old man winced slightly as he bent to pick up a container of ingredients, as though his body had started pushing back against the daily strain. Mason moved instinctively to help, but Arthur simply placed his hand on the table, took a deep breath, and carried on without assistance. That resilience clenched something in Mason's chest, but at that very moment, something else triggered his alarm. While retrieving butter from the back cooler, Mason overheard muffled voices from the small room near the electrical panel. The door was ajar and the voice he heard made him freeze. "That old guy's losing it. Forgot to log the orders again yesterday. Becca had to fix the books all evening." It was Vanessa's voice, laced with calculated contempt. Cole chuckled. "Even better. Let him dig his own grave. We just have to stop helping." "Exactly," Vanessa added. "Or maybe just accidentally leave him near the register at lunch. Becca sees that and boom, done." Mason couldn't breathe. His heartbeat pounded in his ears like war drums. What they were saying wasn't just careless, it was deliberate, cold, strategic. He backed out of the cooler slowly, fingers gripping the butter like he was trying to crush the thought out of existence. When he returned to the kitchen, Arthur was still by the table, kneading dough with clouded eyes, unaware of the storm gathering around him. Mason looked at the man who still wiped stray flour from every edge, who used his own money to feed strangers, and who was now the target of a cruel setup just because he was too kind. Mason's throat tightened. He knew that if he didn't act, it would only be a matter of days before Arthur was cornered. During their break, Mason sat beside Arthur on the back steps behind the kitchen. The wind bit through their jackets, but Arthur didn't flinch. "Are you cold?" Mason asked, trying to mask the emotion in his voice. "Not as cold as the gaze of someone who no longer needs you," Arthur replied, eyes gazing off into the gray sky, then gave a faint smile. "Just kidding, probably just old bones being dramatic." Mason clenched the coffee can in his hand, then softly said, "I think they're not being fair to you." Arthur was silent for a moment. "You know," he said, "injustice doesn't begin with shouting, it begins with silence." He looked up at the overcast sky. "I used to think that if I worked hard and stayed kind, people would understand, but not everyone learns by observing. Most believe whatever's easiest to blame." Then he turned to Mason, eyes clouded but burning with clarity. "You're still young. You see it all, don't you? I ask just one thing. Don't let kindness be buried in silence." That sentence struck Mason like a silent blade to the heart. He couldn't stay silent. But if he acted too soon, Vanessa and Cole's scheme would vanish back into the shadows, only to repeat itself on someone else. He needed proof. And he needed someone willing to step into the role of the victim to expose the truth. That night, Mason didn't go straight home. He sat in his car behind the shop where Arthur usually walked. For the first time, he followed him from a distance. What he saw made his chest tighten. Arthur didn't take a bus. He had no bike. He didn't walk toward any apartment complex. He circled behind the shop, unlocked a rusted padlock on an old shipping container near the warehouse, and stepped inside as if returning to a familiar room. Through the small gap in the door, Mason saw a faint flashlight beam inside the container, illuminating a foldable bed, a few cans of food, an old electric kettle, and a framed photo of a middle-aged woman by the pillow. No home, no warm bed, no dinner, just silence and a pride too great to ask for a place to stay. Mason remained in his car past midnight, hands still gripping the steering wheel. He knew then Arthur wasn't just a baker. He was the last brick wall holding back a culture of decay. And if Mason did nothing, men like Arthur would be erased from this world by those younger, faster, but colder than the night wind. Tomorrow, Mason promised himself, would be the first step toward truth. The next morning, before the sky had fully brightened, Mason was already at Hearth and Rye's bakery. But today, he didn't walk straight through the front door. He stood off in the distance, hands in his coat pockets, eyes fixed on the path behind the warehouse, the same path where, the night before, he had watched Arthur disappear into that weathered old shipping container like a man invisible to the world. The wind was sharper than usual, slipping through his collar and making the metal gate creak. But Mason stayed where he was, waiting for a familiar figure. And then he appeared, slightly hunched over, carrying a crumpled paper bag. carefully locking the container door behind him, as if leaving a luxury apartment. Arthur adjusted his scarf and quietly headed toward the bakery, without a word of complaint, without a trace of bitterness, just lowered eyes and steady, solemn steps. Only after Arthur entered the kitchen did Mason finally go in, stretching as he moved toward the sink. "Feels colder this morning," he said softly. Arthur nodded. "Yeah, my bones know the weather before the sky does." He smiled faintly, a smile as brief as winter breath. But Mason didn't smile back. He looked at Arthur's hands under the running water, fingers cracked from the cold, a dusting of flour from the day before still clinging to his nails. That perseverance stunned him. Suddenly, all those financial reports and personnel charts he used to comb through in the office felt meaningless. What truly held this bakery together were those hands, that quiet presence, that unspoken faith in honest work amidst a crumbling world. A few hours later, the shop grew busy. Vanessa looked occupied, but Mason noticed she kept glancing toward Arthur. Cole, as usual, hovered near the espresso machine, joking around with eyes full of calculation. Mason knew their moment was approaching. Mid-shift, when Becca stepped out from the office with the inventory sheet, her brows furrowed. "Why is the flour order 2 bags short this week?" she asked loudly, just enough for everyone in the kitchen to hear. Vanessa jumped in. I saw Arthur checking the shipment yesterday. Maybe he?" Her sentence trailed off, but her eyes landed right on the man wiping flour near the oven. Arthur looked up calmly. "I did nothing but check the stock, just like always." But the mood in the kitchen had already shifted. Mason knew he had to act before things spiraled out of control. That afternoon, he left the shop earlier than usual, not to go home, not to the company office, but to a small cafe where an older woman with gray hair was already waiting. "Mrs. Carroll?" he asked gently. "Yes, and you're Mason?" "I am. I need your help, for Arthur." Carol sipped her tea and nodded. "I've said it before, Arthur is the reason I still believe in kindness. If you need to expose something, I'm in." Mason pulled a floor plan of the bakery from his bag and pointed to the storage area. "I need you to come to the shop tomorrow morning with a few people you trust, during peak hours. I'll handle the rest." Carol studied him for a long moment, then took his hand. "You know, there are some things that shouldn't need proving, but sometimes, to protect what's right, we must prove it to those who choose not to see." And she agreed. That night, Mason returned to the bakery once more, this time not to observe. He met with a technician from a security firm, someone who owed him a big favor. "I need you to install 2 hidden cameras, one near the front register, one in the storage area." "What for?" "To capture the truth." By midnight, the bakery was dark, but 2 tiny glass eyes had come to life. That night, Mason didn't sleep. He sat in his car, staring up at the dark sky, his heart as cold as the wind, yet burning hot like proof rising in a baker's oven. He knew that in just one more day, the truth would start to rise, and this time no one would be able to knead it back down. On Thursday morning, the sky seemed to hold its breath, mist still clinging to the bakery windows of Hearth and Rise, but inside everything had been meticulously prepared by Mason. He wore his old jacket, pulled on his faded baseball cap, and returned to his usual spot behind the kitchen. But this time, his eyes weren't just on the rising dough. They tracked every movement, every word from Vanessa and Cole. The cameras, installed the night before, were hidden discreetly behind the menu board and a tissue box near the register. They made no sound, but they were listening, recording the truth, the one that had long existed only in the bowed gaze of Arthur. At exactly 9:12 a.m., the doorbell chimed softly, and Melissa stepped in, holding the hand of her 6-year-old daughter. She looked around, visibly nervous, then approached the counter and ordered a cup of tomato soup, a grilled cheese sandwich, and a hot cocoa. Vanessa stood at the register, her makeup heavier than usual, flashing a cold smile. "That'll be $11, she said. Melissa fumbled through her wallet, worry etched across her face. "I'm sorry, I only have $7. Could I work in the kitchen to make up the difference?" Vanessa folded her arms, voice rising. "This is a bakery, not a charity. You should have checked your wallet before you ordered." The little girl clutched her mother's hand and shrank back, while customers nearby began turning their heads. And then, just like always, Arthur stepped out from the kitchen. Without a word, he pulled a crumpled $20 bill from his pocket and placed it on the counter. "Cover her order, and give the girl a raisin bun. It's a cold day," he said. Melissa whispered her thanks, eyes glassy with tears. The little girl murmured, "Thank you, sir." Arthur smiled softly and returned to the kitchen, his hands still damp from washing trays, but this time Mason caught the look on Vanessa's face. It wasn't annoyance, it was satisfaction. She turned to Cole and whispered, "See?" He touched the money again. Cole smirked. "He's done. No one's saving him this time." What they didn't know was that the entire scene had been recorded from two different camera angles, clear, undeniable, and irreversible. Mason walked over to the dough mixer, feigning busyness, though his heart pounded. He had been right. They'd set the trap, and Arthur, like always, walked into it unguarded, simply because he couldn't ignore someone in need. But unlike before, this time it wasn't just Mason who witnessed it. And more importantly, seated at the window table, Carol had been there from the beginning, watching it all unfold, accompanied by two other elderly women, one a longtime customer, the other the florist from down the street, whom Arthur once quietly helped when her mother was in the hospital. After the shift, Mason didn't go home. He met Melissa at a nearby cafe. She placed her cup of cocoa on the table, her hands still trembling. "I never thought pretending to test a good man would hurt this much. He didn't ask why, didn't judge, he just helped," she said. Mason nodded, staring into the distance. "And they want to turn that kindness into guilt." He opened his laptop and showed Melissa the footage from that morning. Melissa clenched her hands. "If you need a witness, I'm ready." Mason nodded. "Tomorrow, we won't just prove he's innocent. We'll restore justice for him with truth and light." That evening, as Arthur closed the bakery like he always did, he still had no idea that his final act of kindness, a crumpled 20 and a small pastry, had ignited the spark of change. Mason sat in his car, gripping the remote connected to the hidden camera system. Inside him, anger and compassion had fused into a blade-sharp resolve. Tomorrow, every scheme they'd planned would unravel. No more whispers behind backs, no more traps in the dark. Tomorrow, justice would be baked fresh in the very ovens of Hearth and Rise. And this time, it wouldn't smolder in silence, it would roar like fire, waking the entire bakery from its slumber. The next morning, cold wind swept through the cracks of Hearth and Rise's doors, carrying the damp breath of a gloomy day on the verge of awakening. Mason arrived before the sky had fully brightened. He didn't head straight into the kitchen like he usually did. Instead, he stood in front of the bakery for a long moment, as if listening to the breath of the place he once built. Today, what baked in the oven wasn't just bread, but the truth, the very thing he had lost for too long amid pristine reports and the hollow laughter of those who appeared diligent on the outside but were rotten within. Arthur arrived early as usual, clutching his familiar paper bag, walking a bit slower but still with his usual rhythm. "Good morning," he said as he passed Mason, who simply nodded. In his eyes remained calm, no suspicion, no defense. That, to Mason, was the most heartbreaking part. Arthur's kindness had never known how to guard itself. By 7 o'clock, Vanessa and Cole showed up too, laughing over something on a phone. They walked past Mason, oblivious to the fact that his gaze today was not that of a trainee, but of a man who knew everything. They had no idea that something else was rising in the oven, a loaf, called justice, at exactly 11:08 a.m. 11:08. Rebecca stepped out from the office holding the inventory sheet, her face furrowed. "We're short on cash again. This time, it's $28. Her voice was loud enough to draw attention, and as if on cue, Vanessa was the first to step in, feigning surprise. "That's strange. I saw Arthur near the register this morning. When that woman didn't pay in full, maybe he—" She left the sentence hanging. Cole chimed in. "I'm not accusing anyone, but if someone who shouldn't be touching the register did anyway," Becca turned to Arthur. Do you have anything to say? Arthur stood quietly by the sink, hands submerged in soapy water. He looked up, voice so soft it nearly dissolved into the sound of the coffee machine. I was just helping her. I used my own money. I never touched the till. Vanessa crossed her arms. Then why isn't the money there? A heavy silence followed. And then Mason stepped out from the kitchen, holding a small black remote, quietly placing his old baseball cap on the counter. I'll answer for him, he said, voice calm but every word sharp as a blade. Vanessa startled. What? Becca turned, stunned. Mason? No, he cut in. I'm Mason Hartley, founder of Hearth and Rise, and I've been here for the past week, observing both of you. The room froze. Cole looked like he'd swallowed his tongue, and Vanessa turned pale. Mason turned to the screen mounted above the register normally used to display the menu. He pressed a button. The screen flickered, then played footage. Vanessa secretly deleting orders after customers left. Cole intentionally shortchanging customers. And then, a clear shot of Arthur pulling money from his wallet and placing it in the register without touching any other cash. The bakery went silent. Customers stood up. A little girl near the corner tugged her mother's hand and whispered, Mom, that's the man from yesterday, right? Mason stared directly at the two stunned employees. Arthur has quietly kept this place on beat, kept the spirit I once dreamed of alive. And the two of you betrayed that trust, manipulated his kindness to stage a false accusation. Vanessa opened her mouth to speak, but Mason raised his hand. No need. I've already called the authorities. They're on their way. Becca stood frozen, clipboard falling from her hand. Customers began to applaud, not out of spite, but because the truth had finally spoken. Arthur stood motionless, his hands still wet. He wasn't used to being vindicated. He wasn't used to being seen for his true worth. Mason stepped forward and placed a hand on his shoulder. You don't need to say a thing, but from today onward, no one will ever be allowed to disrespect you again. I promise that, just as I promised to build this place to nourish both bread and character. And for the first time in years, Arthur nodded, his eyes rimmed red but shining with a light Mason had never seen before. Recognition, validation, the chance to be a good man without having to bow his head. The next morning, when Hearth and Rise opened like any other day, the atmosphere inside was no longer the same. It wasn't just the scent of baked bread and coffee anymore. It was a hush of respect, spreading from the kitchen counter to the farthest table. Arthur entered as usual, still wearing his faded flannel shirt and holding the familiar brown paper bag. But today, as he opened the door, the entire shop turned to look at him. Then, gently, almost naturally, a young employee bowed his head in greeting. An elderly customer smiled at him. Becca came out of the office holding the inventory sheet, but this time she didn't look at her clipboard first. She looked at him and nodded. Good morning, Arthur. Just 3 words, but they made him pause for a moment, as if his heart skipped a beat at something unfamiliar being called by name, with respect. In the kitchen, Mason leaned against the counter, no longer wearing a hat, no longer hiding who he was. He waved Arthur into the small office in the back, which he had cleared of all charts and reports, leaving only a folder and 2 cups of hot coffee. Arthur sat down slowly, hands resting on his lap like a man waiting for judgment. But Mason didn't reach for the papers. He just looked at him, voice calm and warm. Arthur, yesterday wasn't just about clearing your name. Yesterday was my apology for everything I failed to see before. Arthur gently shook his head. I don't need an apology. But I need to say it, Mason replied. He pushed the folder toward him. Inside is your new contract. Title, Community and Staff Development Manager. No more heavy lifting, no more working next to the hot ovens, no more waking up at 3 a.m. to knead dough alone. Arthur opened the folder, read the salary, then looked up, bewildered. This is too much. No, Mason smiled. This is too late. A moment of silence passed, then Mason continued. I also bought you a small house, Just 2 blocks from here. Fully furnished. No more sleeping curled up in that cold container behind the warehouse. We'll help move your things over this weekend." Arthur looked at him for a long time, as if struggling to believe a day like this could exist. "I don't want to be a burden," he said softly. "You never were," Mason replied, his eyes stinging. "You've been the silent foundation of this place, and I was too blind to see it before everything nearly collapsed." They shook hands, a firm, long handshake, no further words needed. That afternoon, Mason stood on the small wooden step behind the counter, addressing the entire team, old staff, new hires, regulars, and new faces alike, with a clear voice. "From today forward, every employee at Hearth and Rise will receive a living wage, health insurance, and emergency assistance access. No one here should ever have to choose between paying rent and helping a stranger in need." No one applauded right away. They just looked at each other, then turned to Arthur standing quietly near the oven, and this time it was he who received the first round of applause. It wasn't loud, just enough for each clap to strike the heart. Moments later, Melissa returned, holding her daughter Lily's hand. The little girl stepped forward and handed Arthur a hand-drawn card made with wax crayons, a crooked loaf of bread, and the wobbly words, "You are a good man." Arthur took it, hands trembling. "Thank you, little one." "I'll come back," she said, "because your bread is the warmest." A few bowed their heads as tears fell. That evening, Mason locked the shop with his own hands, then stood there, gazing at the weathered wooden sign faded by the years of sun. He smiled. Today wasn't a profitable day in terms of revenue, but it was a victorious one for what was right. No media campaign, no slogans, just one person brave enough to choose what was right. And this time, that person wasn't him. It was Arthur, the man who had kept the soul of Hearth and Rise alive with calloused hands and a heart that never needed proving. On Saturday morning, sunlight spilled through the windows of Hearth and Rise earlier than usual, quietly illuminating the freshly baked loaves and the faces of those who were no longer just employees but had become part of the soul of the place. But today, they all knew something was about to change. Becca, the manager who once seemed overwhelmed and unsure, stepped out of the office and posted a notice on the wooden board near the counter. "There will be a full staff meeting today at 10 o'clock. No one groaned. No one asked why. Everyone understood after everything, the right thing was finally coming. Arthur arrived right on time, just as he always did. But for the first time in years, he didn't carry his brown paper lunch bag, nor did he enter quietly through the back door. He came in from the main street, walking upright, the old flannel shirt replaced by a simple, crisp button-down. He looked around and nodded gently as he met each gaze. Those who had called him the old man yesterday now looked at him with respect, but he didn't bask in it. He simply smiled softly, as if afraid his smile might make someone feel ashamed for once being wrong. Mason stood waiting near the kitchen, holding a small oak box. He invited Arthur into the meeting room at the back of the bakery today. It was cleared out, carpeted modestly with water and fresh coffee set up. The staff stood in a circle. Regular customers were also invited to stay. Little Lily sat in the front row with her mother, clutching a worn-out card. Mason stepped forward, eyes fixed on Arthur. "Today," he began, "we're not meeting to review targets or payroll. Today we're pausing the bread to talk about people, about what makes a bakery feel like home." Every gaze turned to Arthur. "I used to think this place was built with flour, yeast, and the hunger to start something, but I was wrong. It was built with cold mornings when Arthur arrived earlier than everyone else, with the dollars he slipped into the till when a customer came up short, with the towels he used to clean corners no one else noticed." Mason opened the oak box and took out a small medallion, engraved with the words, "The Keeper of the Flame." He stepped forward and placed it directly in Arthur's hands. "You didn't just keep the oven burning, you kept justice alive when it was easiest to let it go." Arthur held the tiny object tightly, eyes rimmed with red, though no tears fell. His hands trembled slightly, but he did not let go. Everyone stood, Applause followed, not loud, not forced, but full of true gratitude. As the room settled, Mason turned to the staff. Starting today, every new employee will be trained by Arthur in our service culture, not just how to fold napkins or time the oven, but how to recognize someone in need without asking, how to put kindness before policy. Lily stepped forward and handed Arthur a new drawing, this time showing him standing next to the oven with a golden halo glowing behind him. "I drew you as a superhero," she whispered, "because Mommy says the strongest people are the ones who help without needing to be thanked." Arthur looked at the drawing, then looked around the room. "I didn't do any of this to be remembered," he said softly. "I just wanted this bakery to keep the taste she loved." She, Mason, understood at once was his late wife, the one Arthur had quietly paid hospital bills for over the years. And today, in his eyes, there was no weariness left, only peace. That afternoon, Hearth and Rise was busier than usual, but the difference wasn't in the number of orders. It was in how people spoke to each other, gentler, more sincere. The bread was still just as good as before, but this time customers said, "It tastes like a place that knows how to care." And Mason, the founder, stepped out last, standing beside Arthur in the kitchen, shoulder to shoulder. No more promises were needed, because now the bakery had found its flamekeeper again, and the fire, from this moment on, would never go out. A week had passed since Arthur was vindicated, but for those who remained at Hearth and Rise, it wasn't just the story of one day or one man. It was a moment of awakening, a reminder that what holds a place together isn't spotless tiles or quarterly profits, but the quiet presence of people who live for others, even if it's just through a loaf of bread offered at the right time. On Monday, when Mason walked into the bakery no longer wearing his old cap or pretending to be an apprentice, regular customers still called his name, but this time with genuine smiles, not because he was the owner, but because he had dared to return as a decent human being. He shook hands with each staff member, asked about their lives with honest eyes. On the bulletin board near the register, where once only schedules and rules were pinned, there now hung a wooden frame with the words, "If Arthur has ever helped you, write it here." At first, just a few scribbled notes appeared, then dozens, then hundreds of thank yous. "He helped me when I got laid off." Arthur remembered my mom's name after her surgery. I was homeless and he gave me bread every morning. No two messages were the same, but all told one truth: kindness is real. Arthur still worked every morning, but no longer stayed late into the evening, no longer lunched on a wrapped slice of bread in his coat pocket. He now had scheduled breaks, a chair in a small office, and a warm home just 2 blocks away. Yet he never gave up the habit of greeting customers by name, asking if their grandmother had recovered. And when a shy little boy visited for the first time, he still bent down with a gentle smile and said, "Take your time, son. The bread won't run away." Becca, the young manager who once lacked the strength to see what was right, now reviewed the books herself each morning before handing off the shift. She quietly thanked Arthur at the end of every morning, not because he asked, but because she wanted to learn how to lead not just by title, but by listening. And Mason, he had changed more than anyone. He decided to put on hold the plan to open more branches. "I don't need 5 more locations," he said during a team meeting. "I need 5 places where employees are called by their real names and treated like they matter." He started hosting weekly conversations not to monitor productivity, but to listen to what had gone unspoken. And in those meetings, Arthur always sat in the front row, silent, arms gently crossed, but with eyes that gleamed, knowing that his quiet presence was finally respected. One late afternoon, Mason stood in front of the bakery, watching the steady flow of people coming and going like rising dough. The sky bathed in golden twilight, and through the sound of children laughing in the corner, he saw again what he had once lost, the soul of the bakery. Not something you can put into a business plan, but the only thing that keeps people coming back, day after day. Hearth and Rise had come back to life not through marketing campaigns or new menu items, but through the courage to pause, to reflect, and to give kindness back to the one who never stopped giving. And Arthur, who once slept in the darkness behind the storeroom, had become the guiding light for the younger ones, learning how to slow down, to endure, and to remember that in a world full of noise and competition, sometimes one person standing still is enough to make everything better. This story isn't just about bread or a little bakery on the corner, but about how one person quietly preserved the core values that were at risk of being forgotten in the cold machinery of profit. When kindness is dismissed as weakness, it's persistence, quiet strength, and integrity that become the flame keeping an entire team warm. If you believe that kindness is never outdated, hit like and subscribe to join us on the journey of reclaiming what truly matters. And don't forget to leave a comment with these 3 words: keep it warm. Because sometimes, one warm soul is all it takes to bring life back to a cold room.